U.S. is saying a final farewell to Jimmy Carter today. The late U.S. president is being honored in Washington with a state funeral before being buried at his home in Georgia. The Nobel Peace Prize winner died last week at 100 years old, the longest living U.S. president in history. Now, just hours ago, the incoming president, Donald Trump, also stopped by to pay his respects alongside his wife, Melania, before that funeral later today. Vedika Bahel takes a closer look.
Here in Washington, D.C., thousands of mourners continue to pour into the U.S. Capitol building, where President Jimmy Carter's body lies in state. Looking to pay their final respect to the Georgia Democrat and 39th president, who died last month at the age of 100.
It's an opportunity to honor the president. I feel that Jimmy Carter is definitely underrated in his years, and it's an opportunity to say goodbye and give our respects to him and his family.
I thought the work of the Carter Center was pretty amazing, the way that they've sort of done their outreach around the world.
President Carter was the governor of the great state of Georgia when I was born, so he's been around my whole entire being, and I just wanted to pay my respects to a decent person.
Meanwhile, preparations are underway for the late president's state funeral, due to take place Thursday morning, with 3 stages planned for the day. It will start with Carter's remains being transported to the Washington National Cathedral for the National Funeral Service, where President Joe Biden will deliver a eulogy. An incoming president, Donald Trump, is expected to be in attendance, as well as all living former presidents. Carter will then be moved a final time via special air mission and then motorcade to his hometown in Plains, Georgia, for a private funeral service with his family in the afternoon, before concluding with a private interment at the Carter family residence, where he'll be buried alongside late wife Roslynn. Born James Earl Carter, the one-time peanut farmer entered Georgia politics in the 1960s, a strong supporter of the civil rights movement and President John F. Kennedy. His rise to the White House was on the back of a push for increased racial and economic equality, promising competent, compassionate government after the national traumas of Vietnam and Watergate. Carter is particularly lauded for his work on the Camp David Accords, a hard-won peace deal between Israel and Egypt that he personally brokered over 12 days at Camp David. Whilst Jimmy Carter's presidency often receives mixed reviews, democracy and human rights are considered hallmarks of his administration, remaining so through his work with the Carter Center.
Our Doug Herbert joins me on set to talk more about the life and the work of Jimmy Carter. And Doug, for many Americans, when you say Jimmy Carter, people tend to think, okay, not such a great president, incredible ex-president. But as the years go by, people are even starting to look more kindly on his years as president as well.
There is an entire rethink on Jimmy Carter, both as president and as ex-president. Look, Jimmy Carter today, in retrospect, is becoming more and more seen as a beacon of morality, of compassion,
decency,
of kindness, of decency, values that naysayers might say are getting harder to find, not just in Washington, but in many places in the world today. Jimmy Carter, let's remember what an outsider he was, right? When he came in, you see them there walking the inaugural route. He was the first U.S. president ever to get out of his motorcade, to exit the motorcade and start walking with his wife and his daughter in hand towards the White House during his inauguration. He invented the common touch, in a sense, before it even existed. This was a man, he campaigned on never telling a lie. And the thing is, when he came into the presidency, and it's easy to forget this today, he was wildly popular. He had approval ratings well above 70%. This was a guy, he was a peanut farmer, right? He grew up without electricity, without running water on his farm. He didn't like Washington in the days where he really meant it. He didn't like politicians. Came into power. Look, we know the conventional wisdom about Jimmy Carter's one term, right? Overshadowed by the tragedy of the Iran hostage crisis in his final year, little over a year in office. It overshadowed everything. He was obsessed with getting the hostages released. It was the headline every night. American anchors counted down the days the hostages had been being held. We do remember the iconic handshake that he helped over 13 days of arduous, grueling negotiations at Camp David, presidential retreat, between Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat. That famous grinning Jimmy Carter on the lawn and Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat. Who thinks of this today? Israel and Egypt presidents smiling at each other? All of that. But like I said, the Iran hostage crisis, domestic turmoil at home, soaring inflation, soaring unemployment. Unfortunately, a lot of this inherited by Jimmy Carter. They severely tainted his image. Lost in the shuffle, Jeannie. What do we forget about his presidency? What are historians trying to bring back to the forefront? He created the education department. He invented the energy department. He put human rights really back on the agenda for the United States. He was the first one to really take climate change and environmental issues seriously before anyone was thinking about them. He is a man, basically, who put a lot of issues on the agenda that did not exist beforehand. And by the way, let's just throw in there, he also completed the opening up of the relationship with China. So he did a lot of things that only today, in retrospect, people are beginning
Right, and all that in one term, because of course he lost then to Ronald Reagan.
Devastating
and he was
landslide
young. He
defeat.
was 56 when he came out of office, and he really kind of redefined what presidents do once they leave office.
Yeah, but there was this short period. You're absolutely right, Jeannie. This was a man who was coming out, devastating loss. Reagan, he only won 6 states plus D.C. Reagan crushed him, 489 to 49 electoral votes. He literally, if you look at the photos of him at that concession speech, he looked like death took a holiday. He had no idea, no clue what he was going to do next. He and Roslynn, Amy, went back to the peanut farm, except the peanut farm was in debt, $1 million in debt. He had to sell it. He sold the peanut farm, kept some of the land, went fishing, went hiking a little bit. Then the light bulb came. He formed the Carter Center. The Carter Center, 1982, that became the vehicle for him to continue doing what he called the unfinished business of his presidency. That was the hard work of promoting peace and democracy and human rights across the world. And the Carter Center really became his raison d'etre, if you will. It was based in Atlanta, the launch pad for using the remnants of his influence as president, what he couldn't do as president, using that as a launch pad to push those issues.
Right, and he started many global missions. I mean, many things that are still very active today.
He went everywhere. Look, when you think of Jimmy Carter, right, you think of conflict resolution, you think of election monitoring, his big missions. He did things that, today you think he did that. He went to Panama. Under Noriega, he eased Noriega out of power. He monitored elections in Panama in 1989. He stood up on a table and basically called the elections fraudulent. Jimmy Carter, and he had moral authority to do this. People respected Jimmy Carter's voice. He went to Nicaragua later. The Sandinistas of Daniel Ortega eased them out of power. Reagan was never able to get the Sandinistas out of power, and he had to use Contra rebels illegally to try to do it. So Carter had a real voice there. He did peace missions. He went to Haiti. He was part of a delegation to Haiti to try to convince the military junta there in the time, 1992, to let the former president, Jean-Bertrand Aristide, return to power. He succeeded. Aristide came back to power. He went to North Korea in 2010, met with all the leaders there. He got the release. He secured the release of an American who had been detained there for illegally entering the country. He had been doing hard labor in North Korea. And I nothing would be complete without saying Carter and Mandela, Nelson Mandela, who was 6 years Jimmy Carter's senior, they really had a close friendship. Mandela invited Jimmy Carter to be part of this group of elder leaders, the elders, as you know. They were often seen together to use their unique voices for moral leadership in a world that sorely needed it. He was rampant across every global horizon, wherever you needed a voice of moral authority.
And another thing people might not know about Jimmy Carter is he was very proactive when it came to global health, even eradicating something that I didn't even know existed.
Yeah. Had you ever heard of guinea worm?
No.
You had never heard of guinea worm, right? Now, I think I had heard of it because we had talked about it once in a report here. But you could be forgiven for never having heard of guinea worm. When Jimmy Carter was president, there were about 3.5 million cases of guinea worm. It is a horrible, deadly disease, predominantly in Africa. And it was literally what it sounds like, a horrible disease. A worm grows in your stomach, protrudes through the skin. You die in horrific ways. Last year, guess how many cases of guinea worm there were in the world? 7. From 3.5 million down to 7. And you can credit Jimmy Carter for making that happen with big teams of volunteers. Guinea worm today is perhaps going to be the second disease to be entirely wiped off the face of the earth after smallpox became the first one in 1980. Besides that, there's a whole list of illnesses. You could go down the list. Diseases such as river blindness, flies that have drunk infected water sting you. Horrible. As the name suggests, you go blind. That hasn't been eradicated, but he's gotten the numbers way down. He went on these missions to places no one ever heard about.
Right. And he also pushed forward with Habitat for Humanity, which now is a global organization.
Another thing, right? You just don't end with the iconic images of Jimmy Carter, right? So you think of him in the election monitoring, you think of him on conflict resolution, but But you also think of him, right, in his 80s and 90s with that saw and sawing wood. He was actually a very skilled carpenter. He knew woodwork very, very well. And he physically chipped in. He and Roslynn went to these sites and helped to build houses, over 4,400 houses in 14 countries. He was always there. He did, even in New York City, a place where like only, rich landlords put up these high-rise condos. Well, maybe before that age. But he helped in the Lower East Side to renovate buildings. He was everywhere. He showed up once in Nashville, Tennessee, at a Habitat for Humanity site. He had a black eye. And they're like, what's wrong, Jimmy? Well, he had taken a fall the day earlier. He needed 14 stitches. This is who Jimmy Carter was. He needed 14 stitches, got the black eye, and still showed up. That was what his commitment was to these missions. He felt it deeply. It was part of the fabric of who he was as a human being. Habitat for Humanity obviously survives beyond him, but he's the reason that it became such an effective vehicle for building houses for the destitute.
And you can't talk about Jimmy Carter without talking about the love of his life, his wife for over 7 decades, Roslynn Carter.
It really is. We always say an incredible love story. This is an incredible love story, right? He was on leave from the U.S. Naval Academy, right, in the mid 1940s. He was driving around Plains, Georgia, right, where he grew up. He spotted Roslynn. He spotted her, but he had been supposed to go on a date that night with the local beauty pageant queen. She turned him down, or she bailed on him. So he was driving around. He was really depressed. He spots Roslynn. It took quite a while. And he told the story many times for her to finally say yes. But once she said yes, and once they got together, it literally was a match made in heaven. Roslynn and Jimmy were not just a 77-year love affair, Jeannie. They were also a political team. She was very active in the White House, his close advisor, close to his heart, but also close to his mind, very influential. And she also worked on mental health issues, which became really big. She really almost invented, alongside him, the role of the modern First Lady.
Doug, we just have a minute left. Do you have any closing thoughts on Jimmy Carter? Anything we haven't talked about?
It's interesting, right? So today, at his official funeral, we will see all the former living presidents all together, including Donald Trump. There had been some speculation right after the death. Will Donald Trump attend? Because he had been highly critical of Jimmy Carter in the past. Even though in an odd way, he sort of respects Jimmy Carter. And surprisingly, actually, Jimmy Carter had been supportive of Donald Trump at one point when Donald Trump was first running for president, saying that he thought the media had been hard on Donald Trump. So not everything is black and white. Not everything is as obvious it may seem. But Donald Trump will, barring some last unforeseen circumstance, last minute, he is going to be at that funeral. All the presidents were there. Whether Republican or Democrat, across the ideological and political divide, presidents come together for Jimmy Carter because he was just that sort of person. He brought people together. I'll just end by telling you, he was asked in an interview what his favorite New Yorker cartoon was. He used to like the New Yorker. And he said there was a New Yorker cartoon of a child saying, Daddy, I want to be a former president. That sort of sums it up. He was very proud of what he did in his post-presidency and his presidency. Wishes he could have done more. His post-presidency, though, Jeannie, I'll leave our viewers with this. 44 years, it was 11 times longer than his presidency.
Wow.
He did a lot of good for the world, not just for the U.S. He did a lot of good for the world.
He certainly did, and was a role model for other former U.S. presidents. Doug, thank you so much for that. Doug Herbert with that look back at the life and work of Jimmy Carter, who is being laid to rest today, first with that state funeral in Washington and then at his home in Georgia.